and uniting East and West across East and West. So I have extremely distinguished guests with me, Princess Victoria from Sicily, Anis Nakash, Professor Dugin, and my friend Jamal Joaquin, who had just published an outstanding book, which is, I would say, 80% of our debate today, Eurasia versus the West, and the centrality of Syria and the Levant in the middle of this debate. So this is, I'll be a sort of non-moderator, because I want to leave the floor to the four of them in an interactive conversation. So we have two main themes to discuss. The first one is multipolarity in the sense of the emergence of a multipolar world. Which are those poles? Where are they? What is behind this emergence? Against whom they are emerging, which is very important. And of course, some lateral and underground details. And of course, most of our discussion, because we are in the Levant, is the centrality of Syria and the Levant in this, in fact, is a clash. There's no other way to define it, between a declining American empire with the satrapies in Europe. Some of us live in the satrapies of Europe, right? And the emergence of a still, I would say it's something in progress. It's a work in progress, like a James Joyce modernist novel, with all the important poles that we know. Russia, China, India, Pakistan, Iran, and Turkey are the most important. So let's begin. I would like to begin with Professor Dugin, so he sets the stage for our discussion based on the different multipolar angles. Professor Dugin.
Thank you very much. I would like to attract your attention to what the shift from unipolarity means in the Middle East. From unipolarity toward multipolarity. First of all, if we consider the ideological, political, and geopolitical space of Arab world, of Levant, of Middle East in bipolar period, we can easily see how two poles affected this area. And on one side there was pro-communist, pro-Soviet or Arab socialist groups, Baas Party, Nasser, and that defined more or less geopolitical position of the Arab world. On the other hand, there was liberal democracy of the West, but interesting that liberal democracy of the West, as well as Soviet communist, weren't presented here directly. There was not so much real international communist Soviet system or liberal democracy. Our Soviet allies were Arab socialist regimes, and the allies of the West were Arabia Saudi, Qatar, not liberal democratic movement, but rather fundamentalist movement, anti-socialist, anti-nationalist in the sense of Baasist, but they were not representative of the real liberal democracy. So there was Arab socialism against Islamic fundamentalism. And Islamic fundamentalism was the tool of second pole of this bipolar world. When the bipolarity was destroyed, there appeared unipolarity. And that was the reason or beginning of the transformation of the Middle East. Middle East immediately was put in the chaos. And the West helped much to destroy all the rest of this Baasist Arab socialist structure in Libya against Muammar Gaddafi, in Iraq against Saddam Hussein, and the Syrian war started precisely in order to overthrow the last representative of this bipolar, the rest of bipolar world Assad, the son of Hafez Assad, one of the leader of this Baathist structure. And once more, the West has used Saudi Arabia, Salafi, and Islamic fundamentalists. They served for them, but they tried as well to impose liberal democracy in open sense. So they had in this unipolar moment two tools in the Middle East, two tools. First, traditional structure of radical Islam, fundamentalist Salafi Islam, and pro-Western groups. They represented absolute minority. So the liberal democracy has no root here. That is absolutely strange for all Levant. And now, finally, the West didn't try to impose some kind of order in the Middle East. So unipolarity meant only destruction, bloody chaos, and division of the state, creation of group controlled by extremists, and that wasn't the order. They have destroyed as well some neutral figures that were pro-American, pro-Western, in order to impose real chaos. So that was chaotic war, and that is unipolarity. Unipolarity means for the Middle East not pro-American liberal democratic regimes installed instead of existing national state. That is destruction. Destruction of Iraq, destruction of Libya, destruction of Syria, destruction of Lebanon, destruction of as well of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia will be as well the victim of this unipolar politics. Now we are coming to multipolarity, because this strategy of Middle East is discredited, totally discredited. So more and when Russia is still here or return to the historic scene when there is the growth of China, we see new pillars of multipolar world, and they attract more and more the attention of Arab countries. So Russian intervention in Syria is turning point of this shift from unipolarity to multipolarity. But that creates completely new challenge for Middle East. What multipolarity will be? Because it is not return to bipolarity, because we have no this socialist system in Russia. So it could not be anymore radical Islam backed by Saudi Arabia that is discredited by its atrocities and absolutely caricatural version of Islamic tradition. So now we are in the void. So there is multipolarity, the shift from unipolarity, but we have no plan for future. So I invite other speaker to think about what this multipolarity could mean for Middle East.
Okay, Jamal Linares, if you allow me, I'll go to you after I go to Victoria, because I like Victoria to perhaps expand on let's say the concept of the imperial chaos or the empire of chaos using Islam and Islamophobia to sow even more chaos in the Levant and in the Middle East as a whole.
Yes, well, definitely. You know, it's very interesting what happened recently. We have a speech by President Macron to the ambassadors, a very recent speech, where he's talking of the decadence of the West and the rise of new civilizations, which is here, which is China, Russia, Iran. So I think we should, this specific speech, you should all try to read it because it's online. I think, and the Sakar Andrzejewski, who's here, quoted, elaborated a thought on it. I think this is very, very interesting because it shows us how the enemy is up to date. You know, so beware. They have been sowing chaos. They've been doing wars. They've been destroying this area, and all this has been based, of course, on fundamentally on the rule of power and money, and on the use of totally distorted Islam. I mean, what they have presented as any form of Islam, starting from Al-Qaeda down to ISIS, of course, has nothing to do with Islam. Alexander used this very good word, which I signed, caricature, a caricature formula of Islam, caricatures, of course, which have nothing to do with the interpretation of Islam. Now, what is going to happen? I mean, the enemy has become subtle. It's understanding that chaos is no longer useful to it. It is understanding that they have to infiltrate this new rising world. These civilizations that Macron describes as alive and rising to the future. So we have to be very careful now. Let's examine the past as a past, the confrontation which I described this morning as a confrontation which has taken place. They have obtained what they could. Now, suddenly, they see that things are happening. I mean, there are Islamic movements that have evolved and are resisting, like Hezbollah, which is very important, essential, because it is showing that Islam can perfectly cohabit with other traditions, that it is protecting the Christians in southern Lebanon, that it has saved Syria. So they can no longer sustain ideas of that Al-Qaeda is Islam. They can no longer sustain this position. They are now going to try a new strategy. I think that we should now understand what this strategy is, because in order to prepare reactions to this, in order to avoid infiltrations, and especially in order to facilitate other groups. Of course, we know that Hezbollah is a prototype. You have the Houthis, you have other groups. Anyhow, other groups that have the possibility of growing up in these areas, we have to facilitate their existence, and therefore we have to know how they will be attacked.
Okay, I think that introduces to the bulk of our discussion, which is the centrality of the Levant and Syria, and Lebanon, of course, in the middle of this transforming process. So, Anis or Jamal, who wants to start?
Anis, Jamal. Age before beauty.
Okay. Okay. Yesterday I was talking about Syria and the resistance and how we have been first power to crush the offensive of the imperialists against our region. It was by our decision, and I think up to now we have been successful in this task. The problem is between monopolarity or multipolarity. It is in the middle. I think we have to find regional integration and cooperation to protect what you are talking about, protect our assets, protect our victory, and develop our ideas for the future. Because maybe it is easy to have a victory, military victory, as a force of resistance, but we cannot develop a new vision or a new horizon for the development or the cooperation or international cooperation. So this is a primary and urgent vision that we have to develop. The West Asia is very important region. We have multi-identity, multi-nationality, multi-religion and sex. And I think the most important problem in this region, because our enemy use this as a weapons, they have been developing the sectarian and confrontation between identities. And if we continue to think the policy will be the result of identity thinking, it will be wrong and will continue the confrontation between identities. We have to go out of the confrontation between identities to the policy, confrontation of policies. So when we are talking about resistance, resistance is not belong to one religion or two religion or one sect or one nationality. This is a principle. When we talk about development and cooperation and the human being, I don't think any religion can say this is for me or this is for my sect. So this is the difference between identity who hide the policy or the policy who can hide the identities. And in our region, we need more policy and not more identities, because everyone has his own identities, and the West could and he use these identities to fight each other. So when we go to the regional cooperation, with our victory in Syria as a main base for the defeating of the global war against Syria, you cannot imagine when we have the data how many countries they have been involved against Syria, how many billions of dollars has been invested in Syria, how many weapons they have been used in Syria, soft weapons or hard weapons, and how many sociological people use the history of our society to use people against people. You cannot imagine, and this is the first time in the world they have been used such a thing, a quantity of weapons, different weapons against one country. But God thinks we could, and now we have our victory very near. So we can say we need immediately a regional cooperation in the region.
Absolutely.
Between the country, between the people of the country, not a hegemony of one identity against the other. Because during 1,400 years, our region was living in the empire situation. The Umayyad, the Abbasi, the Ottomani. But it was enforced by one minority or majority against the other. This is why we call it Umayyad, which is why we call it Abbasi, which is why we call it Osmani. This is not policy. This is Ibn Khaldun philosophy that the Asabiyya, he called it, one against the other, we can control the region. Now we need a policy for a cooperation between all these identities, and like this we can protect our victory against this all international war or universal war against our region. And with this, we can help the multipolarity, we can protect the multipolarity, because the cooperation between Russia and China cannot continue and be victorious without the West Asia, our region, and to develop also the cultural relation, not only give me S-400 or I give you S-300. We need a culture cooperation, economic cooperation, financial cooperation, raw material, communication, etc. And geography, in point of view geography, and you know geography is the most important point in the strategy. Strategy without geography is nothing. So I think our geography is very close, and we can continue each other, and we can have to be able to develop the real new world order with multipolarity, with regional cooperation, and we hope to work in this direction.
And
Thank you.
just a second, Anis, I want to
Yeah,
ask
of course.
something
Yeah,
for
of
him
course.
to elaborate on this point. I don't agree on his position of the Ottoman Empire, because I think that on the contrary, the Ottoman, an empire is something that allows multipolarity within its structure. So I don't agree. I think that an empire can be a prototype. It can be a prototype of Eurasia. We have to find out in which way this prototype has to be transformed, of course, to adapt it to modern days. But the way the Ottoman Empire functioned, the way the Caliph himself was receiving every day of the week a member of a different confessional group, how the whole system of the Ahwal al-Shakhsiyya was organized in the Sharia law within the Ottoman Empire proves that this system has functioned for centuries. It was not an oppressive system. The Yazidis lived in peace through the centuries of the Ottoman Empire, and all the other minorities, so much so that, of course, Christian minorities in the Middle East are considered by the establishment of the Vatican some kind of heretic groups, because they are so ancient, they're so real, they are so near to the origins of the Catholic, of the Christian faith, that they are no longer recognizable in the terms of what the Vatican has become. So I would like Jamal to elaborate on this point.
Exactly. And please expand, starting from your absolutely outstanding analysis, this conflict between land powers and maritime powers, and you started all the way back, Egypt and Mesopotamia.
Yes.
Okay. Actually, I will start from, I need to comment on the issue of the Ottoman Empire. We need to have an alternative understanding of the history of the Ottoman Empire, and I believe that what the Arab nationalists were calling for, without knowing it, was a revival of the Ottoman Empire without Anatolia and the Balkan. So this is to start with. But let me start with the new world order that is getting shape or being shaped right now. I believe that it's our destiny to move towards multipolarity for reasons of concentration of capital. And this is where I quote Paul Kennedy, the historian, who said that an empire is an expanding business, after all. So it keeps on expanding as long as it's making profits. The moment its military power extends and becomes a burden to its economy, it starts to shrink. So in this sense, globalization that is posed as a very new phenomena, I believe that the United States, or the Yankees in the United States, as they stole a lot of things and didn't, let's say, admit where they took it from. Globalization is a very old idea. And the first time it happened, I believe it was at least during the Assyrian age in the first millennium BC, when one power was able to extend its control over all, let's say, trade routes, whether land or maritime. And this is where it could impose its will on other powers. It imposes also its cultural hegemony. So this explains why, for example, the Manchu dynasty that ruled over China for 3 centuries, okay, they used a diversion of the Syriac scripture, which originated in Babylon. There is also a theory that says that even the Cantonese Chinese is originally Sumerian. So I don't know, it's a theory, I'm not, yeah. But what I want to say is that the cradle of civilization was in this region. And it was due to the expansion of early capitalist system. And this is where we had the city-state, then it expanded to an empire. The first empires were established in this area. The first land power in history was Iraq, or ancient Babylon. Why I consider it a land power? Because all its communications relied heavily on either rivers or land communications. While the first, well, you might be puzzled if I say that I consider Egypt as an island, because it has long coasts on the Mediterranean and on the Red Sea, while the West Desert separates it from North Africa with a tiny gateway through Benghazi, and this explains why Benghazi was always important to the national security of Egypt westward. The Aswan highland separated it from Sudan, while there was a stretch of land that linked it to Asia, which was Sinai, and this explains why the defenses of Egypt were always on their, let's say, the first or primary defensive line stretches from Gaza to Bir Saba. And by the way, this might explain the troubles of Sisi now in Egypt, because he might be willing, or there were rumors that he was willing to sacrifice part of Sinai,
Yes.
to establish, I don't know, a Palestinian state, alternative Palestinian state. And this touches to the core of national security of Egypt, established by Thutmose 3,600 years ago. So when we talk about geopolitics, we are talking about given facts. And like Fernand Braudel says, history, when it's explained through geography, we're talking about fixed time. So time doesn't play a role, because we're talking about a static factor, a stable factor that doesn't change. So that's why this region, what they call the Middle East, I remember the time when I was a kid, we used to call it the Arab world or the Arab nation. The Middle East was a colonialist connotation.
Of course.
So this region, it was in this region that we had the first land power and the first maritime power that competed with each other. And the arena for competition was Greater Syria, between Babylon or Babylonian kingdoms and Egyptian kingdoms. I believe that the world system has evolved as an extension to this system that was established thousands of years ago in this region. Any land power, the Persian power, or let's say the Parthians, the Achaemenids before them, were an extension of Babylon. The Assyrians, when and that's why when the Babylonians, or let's say the Parthians, wanted to open up to the world, or first the Achaemenids and then the Parthians, they moved their capital to Babylon. It didn't remain in Persepolis. So, because in Babylon, there was an intersection of important trade routes. Okay? Same for Egypt. Anytime Egypt would expand beyond the delta, it would, let's say, address the world through Damascus or through Syria. And that's why I believe that the destiny of Syria, what goes on in Syria, will determine the course of events in Egypt. And this dichotomy, this bipolarity, it extended throughout time. When the Mongols came, they had to destroy Baghdad because it posed as a competitor to their lines of communication and their trade routes. And on the other hand, maritime powers, Egypt, either it plays the role of the maritime superpower, or it would fall to the maritime superpower in the world. That's why it was Ptolemaic Egypt that posed as a competitor to the Parthians and to the Seleucids at one point. Then with the rise of the Romans, when they controlled the East Mediterranean after the conquest of Syria, They took Egypt without even a battle. Julius Caesar went on a journey. Same happened with Alexander before him, after the Battle of Issus. When he conquered Alexandria, Alexandretta now, okay, he was able to march ahead of his army to Egypt, and he was well received. Saladin, it didn't start with Saladin. It started with Imad ad-Din Zanki, then Nur ad-Din, and then Saladin went as their employee, their representative to Egypt. So what I want to say, in the modern times, by the way, the first attempt for an independent Egypt was with Muhammad Ali Pasha, but his ill chance make him confront the rising maritime power, Great Britain, and later Egypt fell under British occupation. Nasser wanted to have an independent role, but he was unlucky enough to have faced a rising maritime power, which is the United States. So now the world is moving towards multipolarity because all these problems that we are facing, the crisis in 2008, it wasn't caused by the American war on Iraq, but it was caused by the inability of the Americans to get the spoils of war, because America was built on the ethos of invading, conquering, and getting spoils of war, distributing them as trophies. They couldn't do this anymore, and this is leading, there is a concentration of capital in the United States, and this is what I mentioned in the first chapter. Actually, I start with Lenin. With Lenin, right. Yeah. And imperialism, the last stage of capitalism. So we are moving towards multipolarity, not towards a socialist system, a utopia, but towards it's in the favor and the benefit of the capitalists themselves to have multipolarity, because instead of having one branch, capital concentrated in one place, multipolarity could better serve an international capitalist system with many branches that could distribute wealth in a better way and address a wider audience and a wider section of customers, quote unquote. And in this sense, if we go back to this region is the main arena for competition, and it's the region where most killing is happening. We are being killed on everyday basis. I remember when Muhammad Hassanein Haikal, the famous journalist, said in the 1990s, I fear a day when I fear that we reach a day when daily death becomes our daily meal. That's what he said back in the 1990s. So why is that? I believe that because we don't have an independent role. There is no independent role in the region. With all due respect, there is a status quo between the Eurasian bloc now and the Atlantic bloc, headed by the United States of America. And there is a status quo. There was an attempt. The Americans are trying to attack in the Middle East, and control this area. And from there, they want to manipulate through Afghanistan, the national security of China, of Russia, and Iran by getting to a fragile region, which is Central Asia. But on the other hand, there was an attempt to encircle this attack through the BRICS. Why it failed? I believe it failed because the BRICS countries or Eurasia couldn't detach yet Egypt from American hegemony, because American hegemony over Egypt gives it full control of maritime trade routes, and that's why India cannot challenge American hegemony as long as maritime communications, its maritime communications are controlled by the United States. And this is one of the reasons why Dilma Rousseff failed in Brazil. This is another reason why it was imperative for Russia to re-intervene in the Caribbean, and that's why I call for Russia to strengthen its ties with Cuba, with Venezuela, and most important, this very important Nicaragua Canal that is posing as an alternative to Panama Canal. Okay, just one last point. I believe that Egypt, if we review historical books that date back to the 16th century, how someone like Ibn Iyas was describing the impact and effect of the infiltration of the Portuguese to the Indian Ocean on Egypt, and how Egypt all of a sudden, which was the primary maritime power, became decadent and fell to the Ottoman control. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Wonderful. Anis, please, jump in.
First, I agree with you, Victoria, for the Ottoman Empire. But I make a difference between the popular perception of the empire, Ottoman Empire, and the scientific reality of this one. And our problem in our region, there is a popular perception, very negative about this. Because we are dealing daily with this realpolitik, so we are obliged to change the way of talking about the future is better than talking about the past. What does it mean? Talk about future policy with the actual Turk, not against the actual Turk. This is the first point. From this one, I go to regional cooperation again. Our main goal now is Turkey, because Turkey, from the beginning, it starts with the NATO and the Western program to defeating our resistance in the regions. And they were involved 100% in the war in Syria, unfortunately. Now they understood two things. First, they cannot win. Second, they want to keep their interest, and it is their right, in the region. And we have to help them to go out of this situation, to be close to us, not close to NATO. I think with Russia and China, there is a possibility that one day Turkey can be member of Shanghai and not member of NATO. We have to go in this way because Turkey, geographically, demography, economy, one of essential and important country in the region. First. Second, we have three goals to achieve. First of all, to defeat the American forces, I mean army, and to explain to them that they cannot control the area. I think we achieve it in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and also in Syria. With our war in Israel, also we achieve our second goal, that we are able not to resist against Israel, but also with the promise of our resistance that in the future war with Israel, we will be victorious. This is for sure. So we don't have problem for winning the war. The problem is how we can go out of this identities war in the region, not go out of a confrontation to another confrontation in the area. And this is why we need to develop a new policy with the historical experience, but with a vision for the future. The vision of the future is basic for geography, cooperation, development, also with our friend in Shanghai. This is, we call it policy outside of the identity limitation, outside of one nation limitation, outside of one hegemony. This is the future of the humanity, and this is a new kind of a globalization. This morning we have been listening to the very bad globalization. You were right when you talked about it. And another one talked about multipolarity from the culture. And our Ayatollah talked about a super globalization by a new world order with one principle. So how we can combine these three speech together? This is the new policy we need. This is the new policy. Because also with the super global polarity, with the Mahdi who is coming, when the perception of this idea is sectarian inside Islam, and it is Islamic and not other religion, it will be defeated, theoretically I mean, from the beginning before to be proposed as a policy.
Yes.
So please, when we want to talk about the future of justice in the world, talk about it not as a hero who is coming to help us, but talk about the policy we have to implement it to help us ourselves.
Yes.
And this is why I mean difference between identity and policy. Thank you.
Alexander, please.
I think we have touched very important point. First of all, if we discount identity, and I agree that identity are used by globalists to divide the region, but we could not discount them. We should propose to identities some alternative. So the identities of Middle East should be included in our future project. Otherwise, all project of unification will be destroyed from the beginning. I agree that we need a policy, but the problem, who will be the subject of the policy, the subject of this united entity of Middle East, of Arab world, of Maghreb. And I agree totally with Princess Victoria about necessity to rethink the concept of empire. Finally, we should separate empire of imperialism, of historical element, and consider that as the principle of unification of great or big spaces in Schmittian concept. So we need a kind of big space for Islamic, Arab, Maghreb, Middle Eastern civilization. In that sense, empire could be technical term or big space. I think that it's very important to consider the past. We have modern, hegemonic, Western conception of time when the past doesn't exist. In spiritual concept and the philosophy of Islam, of Christianity and Judaism, the past is not something that doesn't exist. The past exists because the past is the part of the eternity, of the God's creation. And everything created by God cannot disappear completely. So the past is living. We could return in some way to the past, as we could regain the paradise. So coming to eternity, we could restore the past. So for the modernists, the past doesn't exist. For us, the past is the part of the being. That is important. So everything we had in the past in the Middle East, all empires and civilization in some way exist still. And they transpire against the present, and they define the future. So I fully agree that we could go deeper in the past to the Achaemenid Empire, to the Assyrian Empire, Sumer Empire, Syria, Egypt, in order to understand the shape of the future. It is not for the museums. Well, that is the past lives through us, shaping the future. But I suggest to limit the past for this region, put it in the limit of the Islamic civilization, because the Islam is the main force, living force now. That is the past, the present, and the future of this region. But what could we find in the Islamic past as unified policy? I suggest that as a concept that is emerging now, precisely during this conversation, about imperial shadows. What is imperial shadows as a concept? That is something that existed before in the Middle East and doesn't exist anymore now, but somehow still define many identities and politics. So we have 5 imperial shadows for the region. First, imperial, they are Islamic empires concretely existed in the past. First imperial shadow is Arabic one. So that is Saudi Arabia, place where the first Islamic state started, or first Islam was expanded with Prophet Muhammad. That was the first, and that was limited by the territory of Arabian Peninsula. That was the first empire. Second was Umayyad, with the center of Damascus. That was Islamic Syrian empire. Third was Baghdad's Abbasid empire. That was continuation somehow of Achaemenid and Babylonian kingdom. That was very important shift from Damascus of Umayyads to Baghdad of Abbasids. That was different empire. There is the other empire, very important and very often forgotten, Fatimid Caliphate. Fatimid, that explains Shia presence all through the Maghreb, from Morocco to Yemen, and to Saudi Arabia, and to Baghdad, and to the Iran. So the Fatimid Empire is the fourth very important shadow empire, the layer of Islamic being in this policy, this imperial dimension. And there was the last fifth empire of Ottoman empires. So they were superposed in the past, but now we could consider them as layers of political Islamic identity. And when in shaping the future, they were the poles. Because there were multipolarity in the past, not based on national statehood, based on civilization, based on community of culture, uniting different identities. So if we dream, or if we speak about multipolarity, we should have as a kind of example of what existed in the past, and that exists now somehow by the traces or the shadows, and it will define the shape of the future. So I invite you to think more about 5 imperial shadows that could be very positive and futuristic concept in shaping this Islamic pole.
Thank you, Alexander.
Well, I think we have one example of one country in the world where all this is alive still today, and this is Malaysia. Malaysia has been under systematic attack, first by the Chinese, then when Maoism was there, then of course by Wahhabism in the last few years. Because Malaysia is an example of all these stratifications coexisting. Even as you know, maybe it's important to explain that Malaysia has a system of a parliamentary system, and at the same time is a federation of sultanates. The sultans belong to families that today are Muslim, but they have been Buddhists, and before then they were Hindus, the same family. And they have always ruled their own states. There was one extraordinary man from one of these families who managed to liberate Malaysia from the British. And I want to remind to everybody the personality of Tunku Abdul Rahman, because he was a great creator of something. He managed to establish, first of all, he got rid of the British without war, and then he created the system of government of the free new Malaysia, where not only do the different sultans, therefore the different kingdoms of this federation, become a king every 5 years, one of them. So becoming a king, a primus inter pares. So each one has access to the royalty, and to this role of the king as unificator of the past and the present. But also, Malaysia is the one place in the world where aborigines can be ministers. I want to remind you that in Australia, in America, everywhere else, people coming from the jungle, people living on trees, people have been headhunters, are put in camps. In Malaysia, they are ministers. They don't need to change their religion. They have not been obliged to become Muslims or anything else. They are allowed to be what they are. The Punans, the Sarawak Aborigines, they are ruling Malaysia together with the Muslims, together with the Hindus. In Malaysia, one of the typical rituals of Hinduism, which is forbidden in India because it is considered too bloody, which is the Taipusam, is allowed in Malaysia. So Malaysia was one country which it was the first country to experience an attack by globalism. It was an attack by Soros, and who tried to destroy. In fact, he succeeded in destroying the economy of Malaysia, and against all odds, against all all indications by international organizations. The then and now again Prime Minister Mahathir decided to act as a sovereign state. He did exactly the contrary of what was told to him. He blocked the ringgit. He did not make. He made access to the
capital controls.
He introduced capital controls. He was very open in accusing Soros of wanting to attack and destroy his country. And now, after having been criticized, attacked, considered like a pariah of international, economy, nowadays we are finally witnessing writers and scholars who are writing that Malaysia was the first state to act sovereignly with a policy, economic policy that can be considered right, absolutely right. In fact, that's what we are now importing as a model in countries like Italy who want to. So this is a proof that where the past coexists, is made to, it needs a balance. The balance are these rulers, these sultans, who relate to the past, are projected into the present, know how to deal with all the different religions. And I think that this, one of the reasons why Syria of course, Iraq were the countries attacked in this part of the world, was because in fact you had a socialist version of that. The rulers, certainly the version in Syria, could be considered a socialist version of what Malaysia is like, because all the different communities coexisted, cohabited, practiced their religion, participated in the government, continued to practice their different beliefs. And of course, this is what is being under attack, because it is a prototype of the future. It's not, one has to see very clearly that these are prototypes of the future, not nostalgic permanence of the past. So let us consider this and take this, I think, as a basis to work.
Exactly. So, okay, following up, I hope so. I would love to have a discussion open to the floor. So I'm going to introduce our last question for our four panelists. Building up on what, this is an extraordinary, they are my neighbors in Asia. I live in Thailand part-time, so I followed the Prince's explanation. It's absolutely spot on. I remember when there were all these Westerners descending on Malaysia during the Asian financial crisis in '97. They're saying, Mahathir, Malaysia is going down. I said, no, I stand my ground. Indonesia, South Korea, and Thailand may go down, but not us. And history proved them right. So, our last question for the four of you, building up on the Malaysian example. So what would be, in your view, practically, the possibility of these imperial shadows, as Alexander defined, winning over the empire of chaos? Open to you.
Well, I need to comment on a few things that could also be part of my answer. I believe that we need to revisit the Arab Islamic history, because it was much shaped in the past 2 centuries by Orientalists, not only Western Orientalists, but also Oriental Orientalists, okay? The way stated by Edward Said, for example. Even Said, when he was counter-arguing Orientalists, he had elements of Orientalism in his argument. So, and I myself, I was supposed to be an engineer, and I chose to become historian because it was part of searching for identity by going back in history. The Arab Islamic history isn't confined to this central notion of caliphate, because there was a whole world that was, first we had caliphates that were established in the Maghreb for centuries and thousands of years, Islamic ones, and they were separate from the center, okay? Like the Marinids, like the Mohavids, like the Moravids and others. And there was a whole world that was converted to Islam without conquest, which was the basin of the Indian Ocean. Many of the dynasties that rule states in the Indian Ocean came from Yemen or from Oman. So, and there was even a forgotten empire that lasted from the 17th until the 19th century, the Omani empire, for example. So this centrality, or let's say caliph-centric perception, needs to be readdressed, because I believe that Islam, the motto of Islam right from the beginning was, it was a mercantile civilization. It was born in a mercantile city, and unlike Orientalists, I don't believe that Islam came from the desert. Even Mecca was part of the Egyptian cultural sphere, because it was on the eastern part of the Red Sea, which was the main trade route, or let's say link between the East India and the East Mediterranean. So, well, let's think in modern terms, and let's think in terms of the strategy of our, let's say, for me, it's my enemy. The United States is my enemy. So the United States, which is thinking in terms of empire, the elite there, they are working on different levels, on the geographic, let's say, or geopolitical, but also on the financial sphere, on the cultural sphere, whereas, well, Eurasia is succeeding to counter the offensive on the geopolitical level, but the financial sphere and the cultural sphere are yet to be tackled.
Absolutely. This is what.
And worse, they have benefited from Marxist thinking to use it as a tool. Class struggle is used by the United States. The oligarchy there is using class struggle to draw alliances across borders with the upper middle class in each and every country in order to win the whole, over the whole country. And our strategy is to counter this also in terms of class struggle. Why I believe that this Arab region stretching from the Atlantic all the way to the borders of Iran. Iran could be included had it been subject to the same killing that we are subject to now. Thank God it didn't fall to this. But I believe that this region could play an instrumental role in tilting the balance towards Eurasia, because the biggest competition will be over Africa. And
exactly.
The gateway to Africa is the Arab region, and mainly Egypt. And this explains why there were keen attempts by the West to divide Sudan, because Sudan, it was the link between the Islamic Arab North Africa and the Southern Christian and African Africa. That's why it's the West, or mainly the oligarchs of the United States, who invest in Boko Haram to drive a wedge between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. And it also serves another purpose, to make North Africa a wedge between Europe and Africa. So this makes us go back to to Brzezinski and the Grand Chessboard, his original book. Another amendment, the strategic vision, published in 2011, it made amendments. So what I want to say is that this region is very instrumental, and the core of this region is Egypt. It is the one that could play the role of the base. Syria could obstruct plans, but Egypt could be the base of alternative plans. And if Egypt is detached from American influence, it was Nasser that made the Soviet Union a universal power, because it was Nasser who gave a gateway for the Soviet Union to the Arab Islamic world and also to Africa. And this is why we saw Angola becoming communist, Mozambique, and other anti-imperialist countries countering the American hegemony. It was only after the defeat of Nasser that we had the rise of neoliberals and this project of imperialist America. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, if you go back to the importance of Africa, this is what I was saying this morning. I was saying that it is essential. Africa is one of the essential points, and in fact, the only way to transform the situation of Africa is to get rid of the French franc, because that is the oppression. This is the oppression of Africa, and the European nations are experimenting exactly what the 14 African France-Afrique Franks nations are feeling. So this, in fact, there is a fraternity between us, Italians and Greeks, the way we've been treated by the euro, and the way France is treating the African countries it controls through the French franc, of course. So let's get back then to the issue of how to build this new world through the economy, because this is, I think, what is fundamental. If we want to set these new bases, it's going to mean changing the basics of control. And we have to relate back to what Anis said and to what Valérie said, and try to establish. I think Anis was talking of a new economic base, a new financial base to Eurasia, which then has to involve this area. So it means starting from scratch. Valérie can give us a very good insight into this. It means starting from scratch. It means starting new currencies. It means starting an independent economy, an independent and get rid of the financial control by the oligarchy that is ruling the world. This is the beginning of everything. So can Anis explain what is going on?
First of all, I agree with Alexander. This layers, in my book, I talk that during more than 1,400 years, the region was living in the empire situation. And now there is two ways to explain this. Somebody like to go back and say, let's recreate this empire or this, because he has choice between Ottoman or Umayyad. This is not workable. But we can talk about the benefit of cooperation in the future under those layers with the experience, and explain to our people the benefit of cooperation with negotiation and respect, not to impose it by one country for the other country. This is a way to need two things: cooperation between the country of the region, if they accept, and cooperation between the parties and the intellectual of the region. And this will be like elevator, up and down. Because if we leave the country and the government to do this, maybe they are losers, stupid sometimes, and or under pressure. But if we combine this movement between our parties, our NGOs, our intellectual, with the pressure from the government, I think we can achieve this possibility. What we can do, yesterday we have been talking about the weaponization of dollar. This is your article. I can tell you, imagine this scenario. You can, somebody say he's a crazy guy. Bretton Woods, the dollar has been protected and evaluated with the gold. Later on, they say there is no gold. We can use the dollar now because we are a very strong economy, etc., etc. In reality, they make a secret deal with Saudi Arabia with the insurance that the oil has to be sold in dollar and only in dollar. It means every morning, all the population of the world, if they want to buy oil or gas, they have to buy billions of dollars to buy their oil, to buy their oil. And you remember that the price of oil go up to $35 from $12 to $35. Why? Because if the price is higher, it means we are asking for more dollar. And like this, every hour the dollar can be more strong. Today I can tell you this scenario. The oil of Saudi Arabia, who protects the dollar during a years, he's under our missiles, and we can make it in fire anytime we need to tell them that the dollar is not protecting by the oil.
Yes.
This message is a real one. Maybe somebody can say this is crazy, but before 1 week, we target them and we achieve them. So now I am sure that there is no future of the dollar, but please, Shanghai Organization, our government, Iran, Turkey, and everybody, immediately you have to think for the alternative, because we'll be more stupid to go from the umbrella of dollar to the euro umbrella.
No.
So we have to create something else with the channel of the transaction and the channel of dealing and payment. So this is another task, and it is really, really achievable and possible to do it.
Alexander, I leave it to you to wrap this all up.
Thank you. I will be short. First of all, I think that if we accept, and that is very important, this shift from unipolarity to the multipolarity, we need to concentrate on this very important and maybe crucial Middle Eastern, Arab, Islamic pole. We have no idea about it now. We should think about that. There is no some decision already made, something that we could taken for granted. We need to start to think about that, to think, to speak, to make debates. That's already to begin to construct that, because that is semantic war. So we need to more and more and more organize conferences, debates, studies about this pole, because now we have a kind of void as the future of region. We have identity, we have imperialist interests, we have outside players. Thank God there is multiplayers, not only one player, but nevertheless we have no Arab, Middle Eastern subject. It is only object with identity. We need absolutely policy, we need empire, we need the project. And I think that that is most important thing. That could be economic, that could be, could be military. But first of all, we need idea. We lack this idea of this pole. We have in the past the kind of orientation, the layers. We have some common interest, but we lack idea. And idea of this Islamic, Middle Eastern, Northern Maghrebian pole, that is absolutely necessary now. It is just beginning, and all the powers in the world will try to stop us to think in this direction, playing on the regional, local problems, macroeconomic process, and so on and so on. We need to absolutely to establish this pole and something absolutely independent from any other, from us as well, from China as well. So we need the free, independent, sovereign Islamic politics based on the future, more than that, based on the eternity that will include the past, the present, and the future. Thank you.
Fantastic. I'd like to open for the floor for questions, but let's do it the American way. A big round of applause for our panelists, please. The floor is open.
No.
Does this one work? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much for that.
I'm very sorry, but because of time constraints, short questions, please. I'm really, really sorry, but that's the way it is.
I can't totally soundbite right now. I just can't do it. Princess Victoria, you bring up, imperialism has such bad connotations, but the empires themselves are important legacies, and the Ottoman Empire would be one. I haven't heard one person in these layers recognize that there's such a thing as the British Empire too. And in Canada, let me remind you that there would be no Canada if it hadn't been for the resistance of the British Empire against the U.S. secessionists, the secessionists who created the United States. And I'm thankful that, all of North America is not the United States. I do appreciate Canadian sovereignty. And so this British Empire, let's also remember that these empires, in colonizing their these territories, they made deals with the indigenous peoples. There are promises, there are commitments. So what is to be the status of these older commitments in terms of the new secessionists, the new successor states that have planted themselves on these old empires, on the territories of these empires? And these agreements with indigenous peoples, let's remember that the majority of humanity are part of this thing called the non-aligned movement, going back to Bandung in 1955. And so these thousands of indigenous peoples, where do they fit in? Do the Blackfoot, where are they going to be in the multipolar world? These empires were expressions of plurality. They did have multiple centers and diversity, which is one of the buzz phrases. So I just want to add to my voice to your voice and the other voices that the imperial legacies are part of our present, and they do define the world we live in to some extent.
Yes, what you're saying is fantastic, because in fact you remember one thing: the empires were the first operation of destruction by the financial elite that built globalism. The destruction of all the empires was brought about by the banks, the same very banks that are destroying us today. So there was a reason for it, because they thought the empires were opposing their way of controlling the world. So that's why I think that we have to establish some kind of historical truth on all this.
We have only 5 minutes. Questions, please?
No, nobody.
I just wanted to bring up something really quick about the notion of Imam Mahdi, since Brother Anis brought it up. There may be some confusion, but he's not coming to impose Islam on the entire world, or nor is he coming to force anyone to become one religion. Christians will be respected and be allowed to practice as they are in Iran, as we can see in practice. Same with other religions and other religious minorities. Just as we can see Iran in practice today, they don't impose their religion on other regions. They impose the principles of self-determination, of resistance. For example, here in Lebanon, we don't see an Islamic republic. We see a multi-confessional nation. But I think what Brother Anis brought up was a very important point. The concept of the savior as someone that's just going to come and change everything with a snap of the fingers is a very problematic mentality that just enables people to sleep on the couch and not do anything about this world that we are living in. Rather, it requires an active participation to roll out the red carpet, so to speak, in order to prepare the grounds. So that involves us creating these types of policies that will benefit humanity. And so that, for example, when this does happen, it will be something that has already been prepared for. And even for those who have no religion, as Imam Hussein alayhi salam said, even if you have no religion and don't believe in the Day of Judgment, at least be free from tyranny and arrogance in this world. So I think I just want to clarify it so that people have a more positive understanding of the concept of the Mahdi, and they don't view it as something fearful or that will force them to be in a different lifestyle. Thank you.
About that's important point. The multipolarity presupposes acceptance not of one universality, but of several universalities. So that is very important thing. We should believe in universality of our own tradition, of our church, of our understanding of Mahdi, of second coming of Christ, or in some Chinese beliefs. Absolutely, that as universal truth, but we should recognize that there can be, not in the relative way, in different way, they could be the other truth, the other path to God. And I think that for the Sunni world, the concept of Wahdat al-Wujud, it fits better than anything else. Wahdat al-Wujud, that is difference in unity. It is not only unity imposed on all, that is difference that is orientated to the unknown unity, apophatic in the Greek terms. But that is important. Empire should be open. It should be nation state. It should be imperialist. It should be integrative. And our belief in our saviors, they are different, but they could coincide in the common new way of multipolar universalities with S on the end.
I'm sorry, time's up. Yes, last question. Last question.
It's not a question, it's just a statement. It's not longer than 15 seconds. I think it's very important that we remember, especially at the end of this conference, that for all these thoughts and for all these debates we have here, people, especially in the West and in Europe, are persecuted, imprisoned, they lose their jobs, they're isolated from their families and from their friends. I want to remember now again, especially to our friend and comrade and closest friend, Mateusz Piskowski from Poland. I think we should not forget this, that for all the topics we discuss here, people really suffer, not in Iran, not in Lebanon, not in the Islamic world, but in Europe, where the free world is governing. I think that is a very important thought we shouldn't forget, especially at the end. Thank you.
Very good point. Thank you very much. And I hope this is the first of many debates like this. Thank you all.
Thank you very much for attending the open discussion. This is just an announcement, a very important one, and I really do hope you take it religiously. We're going to have, now it's 2 p.m., 2:15, you please come back after your, tea break, whatever you call it. And then every one of our guests, our dear guests, will come to the podium. They will give their statement or their recommendation for the conference. This is going to be broadcasted live. We will have, and it's going to appear later on at different news agencies and at the news this evening. So please be here by exactly 2:15. Exactly 2:15. Thank you very much. God bless you. Thank you. Please start, Jamal. Yeah. Thank you.
You didn't speak of the new credit card.
No, it's in the way.
Let's go have